The rain fell hard against the cracked window of a quiet suburban house, the kind where no one expected horror to live. The night was dark, broken only by the flash of distant lightning. A police siren wailed in the distance, echoing across the empty street. Inside, Detective Ryan Cole pushed open the door, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. The metallic smell of blood hit him before he even reached the hallway. He whispered, "God, not again." The faint hum of a ceiling fan spun lazily above, dripping with red streaks that should never have been there. The camera of the forensic team clicked as Emma Lane, his partner, muttered, "It's the same signature, Ryan." He knelt beside the couch, where a woman's body lay still, her eyes wide open, frozen in fear. A crimson message, smeared across the wall, read, "She smiled too easily." Ryan's heartbeat echoed in his ears, the air thick with dread. He had seen death before, but this one felt personal. Emma said softly, "She was found by her sister. Poor girl is outside shaking." Ryan clenched his jaw. "Whoever did this wanted us to see it," he said, his voice trembling. A soft thud came from the upstairs hallway. Both detectives froze, exchanging a look that said everything. Someone might still be here. The camera zoomed in on the blood trail leading up the stairs. Ryan whispered, "Stay behind me." The steps creaked louder now, every sound slicing through the silence like a scream. A shadow moved near the landing, quick and deliberate. Ryan raised his flashlight, heart pounding. For a split second he saw it, a face peeking from behind a door, wearing a childlike mask, smiling. Then it vanished. The flashlight flickered. Ryan said, "No one leaves until we find who's behind that mask." The house was sealed off, and the rain outside never stopped. The neighbors gathered behind yellow tape, whispering theories they didn't understand. Ryan stood by the doorway, his clothes soaked, staring at the stairs that now looked more like a threat than a path. Emma returned from outside and said, "No one saw anything, not even the neighbor with the dog." Ryan rubbed his temples. "Someone saw. They just don't want to admit it." The wind howled through the broken window, carrying the smell of wet earth and fear. The crime scene team worked quietly, their gloved hands moving with precision. The victim's sister sat in a corner, shaking, her eyes empty. Ryan watched her and muttered, "She doesn't even look like she's here anymore." Emma looked at him and said, "Would you?" He didn't answer. The sound of a camera shutter broke the silence. The red message on the wall seemed to pulse in the light. Ryan whispered to himself, "The killer wants us to read it." A small pool of water collected near the window, reflecting the crimson letters like a nightmare. The storm raged on outside, but inside, it was too quiet, too still. It was the kind of silence that makes you think the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. The thunder rolled again, shaking the fragile windows. Ryan stepped outside, the rain hitting his face like ice. The streetlights flickered as if unsure whether to keep shining. He looked across the quiet neighborhood. Identical houses, same lawns, same secrets. Emma followed, holding her notepad under her jacket. "Ryan, you need rest," she said softly. He shook his head. "Rest doesn't bring people back." His eyes drifted to a nearby security camera mounted above a garage. He pointed. "That might have something." Emma nodded and ran toward it, splashing through puddles. Ryan watched the reflection of police lights dance on the wet road. He thought of the mask he saw, those hollow eyes and that smile. It didn't feel human. "Who hides behind a smile like that?" he whispered. A young officer approached and said, "Detective, we found footprints leading to the back fence." Ryan turned sharply. "Get them casted before the rain washes them out." The camera zoomed out, catching the chaos of blue lights and storm. For a moment it looked like the whole street was drowning in color and sorrow. Back inside, the coroner zipped the bag over the victim's body. Ryan watched in silence as the sound of the zipper cut through the air. Emma placed her hand on his shoulder. "You think it's connected to the previous case?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Same writing style, same tone. But this time, it feels like he's closer." Emma frowned. "Closer to what?" Ryan looked at the message again. "To me," he said. The room dimmed as the power flickered. The shadows seemed to crawl across the walls. Somewhere upstairs, a door creaked open slightly. Both detectives froze. Ryan drew his weapon. "Stay here," he whispered. Each step he took up the staircase echoed like a countdown. The flashlight beam trembled as he reached the top, revealing nothing but an empty hallway. Then a child's laugh, soft, distant, wrong. He turned quickly, but no one was there. Ryan stood in the upstairs hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He called softly, "Who's there?" The light flickered again, and the laugh echoed faintly from a room at the end. He approached slowly, his gun raised. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty, except for a small wooden chair facing the window. On it sat the white mask. The storm outside cast lightning flashes through the glass, illuminating the mask's hollow eyes. Emma's voice came from below. "Ryan, what do you see?" He swallowed hard and replied, "He was here." The wind howled louder, slamming the window shut with a loud crack. The mask rolled to the floor, landing face up. Ryan whispered, "He's playing with us." The screen cut to black with the sound of thunder, ending the first act in chilling silence. The storm eased by dawn, but the street still smelled like rust and rain. The house stood quiet, wrapped in tape and questions. The narrator said Ryan carried the weight of the room in his eyes as he faced the kitchen table. Emma set a stack of photos down and said, "We need to anchor this to her life, not just her death." Ryan nodded and traced a fingertip along a coffee ring as if it held a clue. He said, "She worked at the library, volunteered on weekends, and never missed Sunday calls." Emma replied, "Someone studied her patterns." The victim's sister sat across from them, fingers locked, voice low, as she said, "She trusted people too easily." Ryan said, "Tell us about last week." She breathed in slow and said, "She met a new neighbor at the store." He looked kind. He helped carry boxes. Emma's pen paused. She said, "Name." The sister shook her head. She said, "I never asked." Ryan stared at the hallway where the mask had smiled. He said, "Trust is a door he walks through." The narrator said, "They were not chasing a ghost. They were chasing a routine disguised as kindness." Ryan stood and said, "We rebuild her days and find the crack he used." Emma lifted the photos and said, "We start with the library." The library opened with a bell chime and the hush of paper. The narrator said, "Stacks rose like narrow alleys where secrets could wait." Ryan showed his badge and said, "We need last week's logs." The clerk led them to a small office lined with dust and careful order. Emma said, "She shelved biographies, true crime, and poetry." Ryan replied, "He watches patterns and hides inside them." The clerk pointed to a clipboard and said, "She covered late shifts on Tuesday and Wednesday." Ryan said, "Anyone linger near closing?" The clerk frowned and said, "A man in a blue cap read near the window both nights. He never checked a book." Emma traced dates on the calendar and said, "Blue cap fits with box-carrying neighbor." Ryan studied the glass where rain stains had dried in arcs. He said, "He wants to be seen but not remembered." The narrator said, "Memory fails at edges. Habit fills the gap." Emma said, "Pull camera footage from the parking lot." The clerk nodded. Ryan turned to the stacks and said, "People choose shelves like they choose friends." Emma said, "Then he chose this aisle." The parking lot camera room smelled like old plastic and warm dust. The narrator said, "Time stared back at them in flickers of gray frames." Emma rolled through Tuesday night. She said, "There. Blue cap at 8:41. Ryan leaned in and said, "He watches the door, not the books." Emma scrubbed to Wednesday. She said, 8:36, same stance. He leaves 2 minutes after she does. Ryan tapped the screen. He said, "He never looks at the camera." The clerk said, "That corner floods in heavy rain." Ryan replied, "He knows where shadows live." Emma paused on a frame where the brim tilted just enough to show a hint of jawline. She said, "Narrow face, clean-shaven, average build." The narrator said the image offered almost nothing, which is everything. Ryan said, "Get me a still and send it to patrol." Emma saved the clip and said, "We also need store cameras near the apartments." Ryan nodded and said, "He is polite. He says hello. He learns doors. He keeps the smile ready." The screen froze on a frame of wet asphalt and a vanishing step. They met the landlord in a narrow hallway that smelled like old paint. The narrator said, "The building kept stories in thin walls." Ryan held a tenant list and said, "We need names tied to the last month." The landlord scratched notes and said, "New renter in 3B paid cash." "No references." Emma said, "Blue cap." The landlord nodded slowly. He said, he smiled and helped with groceries. Ryan said, "Do you have a forwarding number?" The landlord shrugged. He said, "Email only." Emma said, "Print it." The printer coughed out a sheet with a clean address. Ryan said, "We traced the domain." The landlord lowered his voice and said, "He fixed a light in the hallway without being asked." The narrator said, "Helpers never ask permission to enter a life." Emma said, "Doorbell cameras." Ryan replied, "Collect them floor by floor." The landlord handed over a spare key tagged 3B. The door to 3B opened on air that felt wrong. The narrator said, "Rooms speak when touched by careful hands." Emma said, "Do not touch switches." Ryan stepped slow and said, "He cleaned." He staged normal. The kitchen counter was dry, too dry. The trash bin held a new liner. Emma said, "Sterile as a tell." Ryan opened a drawer and found a stack of flyers for a charity drive. He said he wore kindness like a shirt. Emma checked the closet and said, "No clothes, only wire hangers." Ryan crouched by the window and said, "But he watched." The glass showed faint prints of a forehead and a nose. The narrator said he leaned in to measure the world he planned to move. Emma lifted a small receipt tucked in the cabinet seam. She said, "Hardware store, zip ties, tape." Ryan stood and said, "He is careful until he is not. Bag it." Emma sealed the evidence and said, "We have his pattern." Ryan looked at the neat sink and said, "And his fear." The narrator said, "Rain gave way to a sky the color of old steel." Ryan and Emma sat in the precinct briefing room, where the hum of vents masked tired breaths. Ryan said, "We have a renter with no past and a mask with a smile." Emma set the hardware receipt on the table and said, "He buys common tools, but he buys them near home." Ryan traced a city map with a pen. He said, "Triangle between library, apartment, and store." Emma replied, "He lives inside a 10-minute circle." A young tech entered and said, "The email points to a proxy." Ryan said, "Of course it does." Emma stared at the mask photo and said, "He wants to be simple and kind until the room goes quiet." Ryan said, "Then he becomes efficient." The narrator said, "Efficiency wears many faces and drinks from calm." Emma added, "We need a face." Ryan said, "Doorbell footage by noon? We canvass the circle." The narrator said, "They walked block by block through neat lawns and quiet cars." Ryan knocked on a blue door and said, "We are looking for a man who helps with boxes." Grace Miller answered with a guarded smile and said, "He helped me last Sunday." Emma said, "Did he wear a cap?" Grace nodded and said, "Blue." Ryan said. Did he give a name? She said. Daniel. Emma exchanged a glance with Ryan. She said, What did he carry? Grace said. Groceries and a small wooden chair. Ryan felt a chill and said, Did he linger? Grace said. He asked about the houses and who lived alone. The narrator said, Polite words can weigh more than lies. Emma handed a card and said, Call if you see Daniel again. Grace closed the door as wind rattled a chime that sounded like glass. The narrator said, The circle narrowed to a corner store that smelled like coffee and floor cleaner. Ryan asked the cashier for Tuesday night footage. The cashier rolled his eyes and said, The camera is old, but it works. Emma leaned in and said, We only need faces near 9. The footage showed a man in a blue cap holding a basket with tape and snacks. Ryan said, Pause. The brim lifted as he paid, and a profile showed a faint scar at the jaw. Emma whispered, There you are. Ryan said, Print me that frame. The cashier said he paid cash and joked about the weather. Emma said, Did he look at people or through them? The cashier paused and said, like he was 2 steps ahead. The narrator said, Confidence does not shout. It hums. Ryan tucked the still into his folder and said, We hunt the scar. The narrator said they returned to the precinct as the day thinned into pale gold. A bulletin board filled fast with arrows and dates. Ryan pinned the scar photo and said, We pushed this to patrol and hospital records. Emma said, Check urgent care for recent cuts. A records clerk said, We have a jaw stitch 3 weeks ago. Patient named Caleb Moore. Ryan said, Address. The clerk read it off and added, He requested no follow-up call. Emma said, He avoids routine contact. Ryan stared at the map and said, Caleb is inside our circle. The narrator said, Names grant shape to shadows. Emma gathered copies and said, We go now. Ryan slid his badge into his pocket and said, He keeps moving. We move faster. The narrator said, Caleb Moore's building sat near the end of a quiet block crowned with bare trees. Ryan and Emma climbed the stairs that sighed under their weight. Ryan said, No uniforms. Calm entry. Emma nodded and said, If he runs to the familiar. They reached the door and listened. A faint hum of a fan, a soft scrape. Ryan knocked and said, Caleb, City Police. The scrape stopped. Silence grew long and careful. Emma whispered, He is counting seconds. Ryan tried the knob. It held, he said. Key from the landlord. Emma slid the key and turned slow. The door opened on a neat room with the table set for tea. The narrator said, Calm is a costume. A white mask sat on the chair, turned toward the window. Emma said, He staged it. Ryan stepped in and saw a note pinned under a metal spoon. He read aloud, We smile, so you'll let us in. The window latch clicked. A shadow moved on the fire escape. The narrator said, The air outside Caleb's apartment thickened as police units spread across the block. Ryan leaned over the fire escape, flashlight cutting through drizzle. He saw only empty metal rails. Emma said, He's gone. Ryan replied, Not far. The kettle on the table still hissed steam. He moved closer and said, He left seconds ago. The narrator said, Silence carried weight heavier than footsteps. Emma's radio crackled with static before a voice said, Rear alley gate open. Ryan rushed to the hallway, heart racing. He said, He wants us to follow. Emma followed tight behind. They reached the alley lit by one dying bulb. A shape moved at the far end, shadows stretching long. Ryan shouted, Police! The figure turned just enough to reveal half a mask and a faint scar. Then it vanished into darkness. Emma said, He's taunting us. Ryan whispered, He's not running. He's leading, the narrator said. The chase had begun, but the direction was his, not theirs. The narrator said, Ryan and Emma reached the street, where the wet pavement glowed with reflections of red and blue lights. Ryan said, Set perimeters east and west. Emma barked orders into her radio. A dog barked somewhere, the sound cutting the night in half. Ryan said he planned the escape route. He moved like water, shaping around walls and sight lines. Emma said he's predicting our response. Ryan replied, we're testing it. The narrator said every hunter knows to make the prey run first. Ryan looked at a narrow side path leading toward a playground. He said that way. They sprinted through the gate, shoes slapping against wet cement. The swings moved faintly, though no wind passed. Emma whispered, he's here. Ryan aimed his flashlight at the sandbox. The beam caught the edge of a mask half buried in the sand. Ryan said, he's leaving breadcrumbs. The narrator said the real trap was not to follow, but they already had. The narrator said, back at the precinct, maps glistened under fluorescent light. Ryan pointed to dots drawn in red. He said each mark is a past scene. Each line forms a pattern. Emma leaned closer and said, it's a spiral. Ryan nodded slowly. He said, he's circling inward, to something or someone. The tech analyst entered holding a file. He said, Caleb Moore's real name isn't Caleb. He's Daniel Hayes, missing since 2012, presumed dead after a warehouse fire. Emma said, that's impossible. The analyst shrugged. He said, prints confirmed. Ryan whispered, he killed before. The narrator said, the story folded back on itself. Emma said he hides behind borrowed faces. Ryan said, and every smile he gives is someone else's memory. The text said, his record stopped the day his family vanished. Emma looked up sharply. She said, vanished? The tech nodded. Ryan clenched his fists. He said this was never random. He's rewriting his own ending. The narrator said, the truth cracked open like thin glass. Ryan stared at a photo of Daniel's family, a wife and daughter lost in the fire. Emma said he lost them, and now he recreates them. Ryan said each victim mirrors his wife's smile. The narrator said the motive was not hate, but a twisted form of love. Ryan's eyes darkened. He said he blames himself and punishes their ghosts in others. Emma whispered that mask isn't to hide, it's to forget. Ryan said no, it's to become. The narrator said revelation dripped slower than blood. The silence in the room was colder than any night. Emma said, so what's next? Ryan replied, we find where he began. The text said, the warehouse from 2012 was rebuilt as storage on Westfield Avenue. Ryan said, then we finish what fire couldn't. The narrator said, the warehouse stood like a scar against the skyline. Ryan's flashlight caught rusted beams and broken glass. Emma said, smells like ash. Ryan said, memory burns longer than flame. Inside, dust floated in the air like old smoke. They reached the center where chalk circles covered the floor. Emma said, he marked this place. Ryan knelt and said, his past ends here. The narrator said, then the faint creak of metal echoed above. Ryan aimed his light. A figure moved along the catwalk, slow, deliberate. Daniel's voice rang out, calm and hollow. He said, you shouldn't have followed. Ryan shouted, it ends tonight. Daniel said, it never ends. The narrator said, the reveal wasn't the mask. It was the face behind it, his own reflection twisted by guilt. The beam caught Daniel's scar as he smiled down, eyes glinting. The narrator said, Ryan moved under the catwalk, gun drawn. Daniel stepped forward, mask half cracked. He said, you hunt what you already are. Ryan said, you murdered Innocence. Daniel laughed softly. He said, I only removed lies. The wind moaned through shattered panes. Emma circled toward the stairs. Ryan said, don't move. Daniel said, "You wear a badge to hide your own ghosts." Ryan's jaw tightened. He said, "Maybe, but I don't kill for comfort." Daniel dropped the rest of the mask, letting it shatter on steel. The narrator said, "Faces break easier than truth." Ryan shouted, "Get down," as Daniel swung a metal bar, sparks lighting the dark. Emma fired a warning shot, the echo rolling through hollow beams. Daniel ducked and ran across the walkway. Ryan followed up the stairs, each step a heartbeat. The narrator said the catwalk trembled under their steps. Daniel turned sharply, bar raised. Ryan blocked the swing with his arm, pain flashing through him. Emma shouted, "Drop it!" Daniel smirked and said, "You drop your fear first." He swung again. Ryan dodged, metal screeching as it hit railing. The narrator said, "The fight was not for victory, but for confession." Ryan shouted, "You killed them because they trusted you." Daniel roared, "I saved them from worse." Emma fired again, grazing his shoulder. Daniel stumbled, dropping the bar. He glared down and said, "They laughed at my failure." Ryan said, "And you made sure they never would again." The narrator said words cut deeper than bullets in that cold air. The narrator said, Daniel's foot slipped on the slick beam. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Ryan reached out and said, "Daunt." Daniel looked at him and smiled faintly. He said, "We both wear masks, detective." Then he stepped back. His body hit the concrete with a sound that silenced the storm outside. Emma shouted, "Ryan!" Ryan leaned over the railing, eyes wide. The narrator said the chase had ended, but the echo remained. Emma climbed up and said, "It's over." Ryan said, "No, it just changed shape." He looked at the shattered mask below. The cracks looked like veins spreading outward. The narrator said, the sirens wailed again as officers filled the warehouse. Rain poured through the roof holes like thin strings. Emma placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. She said, "You did what you had to." Ryan stared at the body below. He said, "He wanted to be seen, not stopped." Emma said, "Then you gave him both." The narrator said, "Justice is heavy when it's personal." Ryan said, "Every face hides something." Emma nodded and said, "But not every smile kills." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of iron and dust. Ryan whispered, "Innocence never stood a chance." The narrator said, "Morning broke pale and distant." The warehouse stood quiet once more. Ryan walked out, raincoat folded over his arm. Emma followed, her steps slower now. She said, "You ever think he started this long before the first murder?" Ryan said, "Maybe. Maybe it started the day someone trusted him." The narrator said, the killer who lurked behind the mask of innocence had finally fallen. But the idea of him lingered in the cracks of every smile. Ryan said, "The masks don't vanish, they move." Emma looked at him and said, "Then we keep watching." The street stretched ahead, washed clean by rain. The narrator said, beneath calm faces, monsters still breathed. The camera pulled back as the wind carried the faint sound of laughter. Soft, familiar, wrong. Dawn turned the city gray and thin, like paper left in rain. The narrator said, the warehouse was quiet now, but echoes held on. Ryan stood by the tape and watched the crew pack up. Emma walked over with 2 coffees. Emma said, "You need sugar." Ryan said, "I need answers." A medic zipped a bag with steady hands. The sound felt final. Emma said, "We will write the report and let it breathe." Ryan stared at the broken mask in an evidence tray. He said he wanted to be seen as decent. Emma said he hurt people who trusted him. The narrator said, the line between pity and rage is thin, but it still holds. A patrol car idled, puffing steam into the morning air. Ryan said, "Notify the families by noon." Emma nodded. She said, "I will take the sister." Ryan closed his eyes for a beat. The wind moved dust in soft curls. The warehouse smelled like metal and wet wood. The narrator said, "The storm had passed, yet a colder weather began in them." Ryan said, "The case is over on paper, not in here," Emma said. "We carry the rest and keep it small." Ryan exhaled and looked toward the river. He said, "Small is all we get." The narrator said, "The precinct hummed with a slower rhythm." Ryan sat at his desk while forms built a wall in front of him. Emma dropped a file and said, "Final list of victims, next of kin, and property holds." Ryan said, "Names first, then dates." He read each name out loud, giving the room weight. Emma said, "I called the sister." She asked if he looked sorry. Ryan folded his hands. He said he looked done. The clock ticked a dry beat on the far wall. The tech analyst stepped in and said, "Media wants a statement." Emma said, "They want safety in words." Ryan said, "Give them facts and quiet." The narrator said, "Closure is not a door. It is a room with less noise." Emma set the mask photo face down. She said, "We end his shape here." Ryan said, "We end the file, not the harm." He reached for a pen and signed the last release. The pen felt heavy in his fingers. The narrator said, "The law closes cases. People close wounds if they can." The narrator said, Emma parked outside a small brick apartment. The victim's sister waited on the steps with a blanket over her shoulders. Emma said, "I'm sorry for your loss and for what you saw." The sister stared at the street. She said, "Did he say why?" Emma chose simple truth. Emma said, "He wanted to control what he could not fix." The sister's hands trembled, then went still. She said she smiled at everyone. That was her mistake. Emma shook her head. Emma said, "Kindness is never a mistake." The narrator said, "Grief tries to bargain with blame, but the cost is the same." A bus passed, stirring fallen leaves. The sister said, "What happens now?" Emma said, "We help you with what comes next. We return what belongs to her." The sister looked up. She said, "Then we bury the rest." Emma nodded once. Emma said, "We stay available." The narrator said, Ryan met with Captain Morris in a quiet office that smelled like old coffee. The captain tapped a pen on the table. Captain Morris said, "You pushed hard, and you kept the city calm." Ryan said, "We were late on his first step." The captain leaned back. Captain Morris said, "You were early on his last one." Ryan stared at a framed photo of a sunny parade. Ryan said, "People trust the smile more than the badge." The captain nodded. Captain Morris said, "Then make the badge kinder and louder." The narrator said, "Praise can feel like a bandage on stone." Ryan stood. Ryan said, "We need a watch list for helpers who enter lives unasked." The captain wrote a note. Captain Morris said, "Build it with Emma and records. Keep it clean." The narrator said, "Evening brought a thin piece to the riverwalk." Ryan and Emma stood by the rail and watched water turn to slate. Emma said, "He wanted a story where hurt made sense." Ryan said, "He wrote the wrong ending for everyone." A jogger passed and looked at the skyline. The breeze smelled like rain and old brick. Emma said, "We do not fix the world." Ryan said, "We keep the pieces steady." The narrator said, "The city takes new breaths after every storm." Emma finished her coffee and tossed the lid. Emma said, "Tomorrow, we start the watch list." Ryan nodded. Ryan said, "Tomorrow, we call the last family again." The sky dimmed until the first lights came on. The narrator said, "Night settled like a final page." Ryan sat alone in the evidence room where silence felt thick. He opened a box marked with the case number. Inside lay the mask, the burned photo and a folded note. He read the note again. Ryan said, "We smile so you let us in." The words were small but loud. The room hummed with the faint buzz of a light. He put the note back and closed the lid with care. Emma stepped in and said, "You are still here." Ryan said, "I wanted to control what I could." Emma said, "You already did. You told the truth." The narrator said, "The truth is not clean, but it stays." Ryan locked the box and placed it on the shelf. He said, "Let's mark it complete." Emma nodded. Emma said, "Then we set the watch list live at dawn." The narrator said, "The briefing room filled with a small team and tired eyes." Ryan projected a map with new flags. Ryan said, "These are entry points. Door-to-door offers, fake maintenance, sudden kindness." Emma said, "We do wellness checks when patterns repeat." A young officer raised a hand. He said, "What do we say when people feel insulted?" Ryan said, "We say we care." The narrator said, "Prevention sounds plain, but it saves lives." Emma handed out cards with clear steps. Emma said, "Call, verify, refuse if unsure." Ryan added a quiet line. Ryan said, "No smile needs a key to your life." The team nodded, the message simple enough to stick. The clock read 9, and the work began. The narrator said, Ryan and Emma walked a quiet block lined with trimmed hedges. A porch light flicked on as they approached. Grace Miller opened the door with a soft smile. Grace said, "Is it over for real?" Ryan said, "The man is gone." Emma said, "But we want the street safer." Grace looked at the step where a stranger once stood. Grace said, "I will ask names next time." Emma said, "Good. Also call if someone insists." The narrator said, "Safety grows when it is shared." A neighbor waved from a driveway and listened in. Ryan handed Grace a card. Ryan said, "This is our direct line." The narrator said, later Ryan paused at a memorial beside the library. Candles flickered in glass jars. Photos leaned against a stone wall. He found the victim's picture and set a white rose near the frame. Emma stood a few steps back. Emma said her sister will come later. Ryan said she should not face this alone. The air smelled like wax and rain. The library windows glowed with soft light. Ryan said, "This street will forget by summer." Emma said, "We will not." The narrator said, "Memory is a promise we make to the quiet." The narrator said, "The final night found them by the river again." The city lights trembled on the water like small truths. Emma said, "Do you hear it sometimes?" Ryan said, "The laugh." Emma said, "Yes." Ryan said, "It fades when we keep working." A fairy horn called from the dark. The wind lifted and let go. Emma said, "We do not chase ghosts. We build gates." Ryan smiled without joy. Ryan said, "Gates hold." The narrator said, "The killer who hid behind a mask of innocence was gone, but the lesson stayed." Emma looked out at the slow current. Emma said, "Tomorrow is another watch." Ryan nodded once. Ryan said, "Tomorrow is enough." The camera held the water until black.